Good evening. The title of my talk is, What's Power Got to Do with It? And I'm not the kind of person to leave you hanging till the end, so I'm going to cut to the chase right now. It has everything to do with it. In the world of cross-cultural facilitation, diversity, and inclusion, my field, we really struggle to talk about institutional power. We talk a lot about personal power, your capacity to make a different individual choice, or your reaction. You can choose your reaction to a situation. We talk a lot about relational power, the kind of power that you might have between a boss and her direct reports. Sometimes we can even talk about situational power, which is the kind that you might have like a local sphere of influence, for example, with the board of directors to change a policy or an organizational direction. But those aren't the kinds of power that I want to talk with you about today. I want to talk with you about institutional power, the kind of power that seeks to suppress us as human beings, the kind of power that leaves its residue on us, that leaves us confused on some level, colluding with institutional oppression and perpetuating mistreatments and hurts on other human beings towards each other through no fault of our own. I believe that if we have a fresh understanding of exactly what power has to do with it, that we can begin to heal from it, that we can begin to have more compassion for ourselves in the places that we might collude with institutional oppression. And we can also begin to act in such a way as to change the systems that would seek to limit us from creating a just world for all. But to bring you to this present moment, and why and how I'm standing here before you, I want to take you back 45 years. I want to take you back to a city in flames, the summer of 1967, Detroit, Michigan, burning with the rage of racism and injustice. My parents, second-generation Mexican-American mom, my immigrant Puerto Rican father, violated curfew, drove into downtown in the heart of a city's rebellion to give birth to me, their second of what would be 3 daughters, at Hutzel Hospital. It was the first in a series of life events that was going to shape my world and shape my consciousness of who I was as a human being. I was born disabled. My parents are both disabled. We were poor. We were on state assistance, and my father collected disability for me until I was 18, and he collects it still to this day. My mother has a high school diploma. My father barely finished 4th grade. School was not his thing. He's an immigrant, and he's Spanish language dominant. I can tell you I grew up in a home full of love, and yet those forces had an impact on me, and they took a toll on my family. Now, some of you are sitting out here today, and you're hearing what I'm saying is my story, and it sounds so different from your own, perhaps. But I'm going to offer you this, and I want you to try and hold on to this for as long as my talk goes this evening. I believe that those very same forces were in play in your own young lives and in the lives of your family. We all dealt with it really different ways, those institutional powers that came in on our families and ourselves. For some of us, we sought to minimize those effects and kind of play them down. Others of us took the route of numbness and detachment. Think about it, how numb, detached we have to be to walk over homeless people. Others of us, well, we sort of thought we got lucky and that somehow we didn't have it as bad as someone else. But I promise you, that was really a cover for denial and downplay. The rest of us, well, it left us angry, consumed with a quiet rage and a sense of powerlessness. I start with my story in hopes that it will recall some of your own. The stories of how we grew up and where we were raised give us clues and insights now about how we handle institutional power. Now, it's possible that you can pick out pretty easily from the little bit I shared of my story, or you could probably guess, that institutional racism, classism, sexism, ableism, anti-immigrant oppression all were at role and had a play in my life. But I want to share with you today that I don't think those were necessarily the oppressions that laid the foundation for me to internalize hopelessness. In fact, I think it was an oppression that most of us have never heard of in this room, but that each and every one of us has experienced. It's the institutionalized and systematic mistreatment of young people, which is the institutionalized oppression of adultism. I ask you, how many of you have ever heard of the concept of adultism before tonight? I have. How many of you have ever heard of the concept before tonight? I've got 2 hands. How many of you have never heard of the concept of adultism before this evening? Okay, I'm not surprised. Even in my field of cross-cultural facilitation and diversity and inclusion, it's not a common concept. We actually don't talk about it that much. And yet, even though it's completely unfamiliar to us, it has impacted our lives. I want to start by talking through what I think adultism is and also what it is not. I think it's important that we have an understanding because it's affected us as adults and continues to affect us today. It's what's getting in our way of really taking principled stands against injustice. And I believe it stops us from really colluding with institutional oppression as it plays out today. And so I want us to think about what exactly is institutionalized adultism. I believe that young people come into this world believing they are absolutely invincible, utterly indestructible, and powerhouses for change. And if any of you have ever crossed paths with a 3-year-old, you know exactly what I'm saying, right? You can't convince that 3-year-old they're not completely in charge of their world. So what has to happen to a child that they lose sight of that? What had to happen to you? I promise you that there was things that happened to us that were actually quite harsh, things that we don't really talk about or acknowledge. And I promise you that it has to do everything with adultism. Adultism is the training ground. It's the place where we become hurt into taking on patterns of victim and perpetrator, of target and not target. We're not born that way. We have to get hurt into those roles first, and that hurt happens through adultism. Adultism is where that powerlessness gets laid in on us. It's in childhood, doing our battles there, that we fight an amazing fight. To hold on to our significance, to our sense of power, to change the world, to make a difference, to do the right thing. But it's also the place where the crushing impact of institutionalized oppression, of adultism in particular, has us give up in some small and sometimes very big ways on ourselves and on our dreams. This does not happen lightly. Think about what would have to happen to a child to give up at that level. And yet all of us did on some level. Adultism is not an individual act against an individual. It is not me waking up one morning as an adult and sort of rubbing my hands together in some premeditated plot to find some young person and torment them today. That's not what I'm talking about. It's not personal. Remember, it's institutional. Adultism is the time you were waiting in line as a child, and the clerk waited on the grown-up behind you, and nobody said a word. It's the time you would so gladly have given up your bed to your grandparent or aunt or visiting relative, but instead you were told, tonight you're going to be on the couch or the basement or in your brother or sister's room. It's the time that you were waiting in the crosswalk to cross, and none of the cars would stop because you were a young person. It's the time it was your word against an adult, and simply because you were young and a child, you weren't considered credible or believable. Adultism is every time that we were pushed aside, neglected, not believed, minimized, humiliated, in any way made to feel small or stupid or inadequate or helpless. And this is something that happens on a systematic, day-by-day basis just because we're a child. Now, you may be tempted to hear me talking about adultism and think, well, maybe that's for those extreme cases, you know, those abuse cases or neglect cases that end up in some child protective services type system. I want to suggest to you that adultism is much more persistent and pervasive, much more insidious and nuanced, and much more socially acceptable than that. If you think about the education system, for example, it's a perfect example of how adultism runs through it. I'm not talking about relationships in the classroom. I'm not talking about teachers. Let's just take the system. Think about the younger the child in preschool, right? Who takes care of preschool children? Well, they're the least paid, least training, least status, least dignity, least job security of anyone that interacts with young people in that system. As the child gets older, you start to see more job security, better pay, more benefits, All of it starts to improve as the child's getting closer to becoming a full adult. By the time you get to the university system, these are the teachers and educators that have the highest pay, highest status, the best benefit package, right? Job security up the wazoo. But even if you just take a university system, like this one that we're in tonight, and you just look at it, if you want to have the best pay and the highest status here, you never interact with students. You become a researcher or an administrator. Your status on a university campus is directly connected with how much day-to-day interaction you have with young people. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about institutional oppression. We have a couple of challenges when we hear these words. It's like, oh, she's making up a new oppression. Don't we have enough of this? But there's also the challenge of adultism. If I'm asking you to really consider giving that up, it's going to be like, oh, children gone wild, right? Oh my gosh, no discipline, no boundaries, no respect. I'm going to offer to you quite the contrary. Children actually need us to set thoughtful limits and guidelines as they begin to explore their world and as they learn that they're in charge. That's our role as adults. I want to be really clear. And they actually want that from us, the thoughtful, caring part. We've too often disguised discipline as necessary, but truly it's an assassination of the core of that child. It ends up being an experience of humiliation and shaming. So it's not whether we discipline, but rather how we discipline. And I think respect isn't something you teach. It's something you model. And I promise you that if you show complete and full respect to a young person, you will get it back in spades. Because you will be the exception to the rule in a society that constantly devalues and demeans who they are and disrespects them. The other challenge that I'm going to offer you is that most of us, now you might be the exception, but most of us experienced our earliest forms of adultism at the hands of people who we love and care so deeply about, and who for the most part put us at the center of their world, and many times made huge sacrifices on our behalf. Our parents, our beloved parents. It's painful often to go back and think about an experience that you had and put this lens of adultism, this new lens on that experience and think, oh my gosh, my parents, they passed this hurt on to me. How could they? I'm betraying them somehow to even think that. Because somewhere, I think, in our confusion about what institutional oppression is, you might think that that means that somehow your parents were bad parents. I think your parents, my parents, any parents in this room, you're heroes. You fought the biggest fight against your own internalized powerlessness to create a better world and experience for your children. Again, fought against the powerlessness that you internalized through no fault of your own. And you did commit and did pass on less than you got yourself. I promise you, you did. Now, if you've arrived at the point of this talk and you think that I'm only talking about parents and young people, or you think that I'm only talking about our childhoods, I want to be very clear that I'm actually talking about all people, parent and non-parent alike. And I'm talking not just about our childhoods, but I'm talking about right now. How many of us, have laughed at that oppressive joke just because we were powerless to think of anything else more creative or elegant to interrupt it at that moment? Go ahead, we can all tell on ourselves. Me too, I teach this stuff, right? Or the time you were leading an organization or a group, right? And you saw yourself replicating that very shaming and critical behavior that you experienced as a childhood that you swore you would never pass down. And there it was. Or the time you were facilitating a group or a meeting. Any of you ever done that? Yeah? And you've got that dominating voice, that person who just won't be quiet and asks all the questions and takes over, and you still can't figure out that elegant solution to interrupt that behavior because it's this replay of a family dynamic that as a child you were never empowered to interrupt in the first place. That's what I'm talking about. It's still impacting us today. It left its residue on us. And until we can go back and really look at what happened to us and clean that up, it's going to persist. It's important to consider that this is pervasive and that it's not your fault. And the more awareness that we have about how pervasive it is, I'm hoping the more compassion you're going to have for the places where you slip up where you can't take that principled stand where you want to, where you allow somehow unawarely or even sometimes awarely the targeting or exclusion of a group or an individual. You are none of you incapable. You are none of you bad people. Remember, this has to do with how we ourselves got targeted. And if we don't look at it and we don't clean up that experience, we will repeat it over and over and over again. Now, if I were going to take a poll right now, and I was going to say, okay, all the adults in the room, all of you who want to go back to your childhood, I don't think I'd get a lot of takers. And it's not that our childhoods weren't great. They were. There were many beautiful and amazing elements of learning and adventure and friendship as part of that. But we've lumped together childhood with adultism. We think it's part of the parcel. We have to get the whole package or we get nothing at all. And I think as long as we allow that to continue, then we can never really create a just world. It's in our best interest to go back and pull out what were those experiences that were mistreatment in the form of adultism, so that we can imagine and thus co-create a childhood that's completely benign. Because that's really what childhood is, and completely free of oppression. I had this opportunity, if you would, to learn this firsthand by following the lead and watching the incredible brilliance of my younger nephew as I took him to a doctor's appointment. We were sitting in a waiting room, and of course, it's filled with children and their caregivers, and we're kind of doing something to pass the time, and all of a sudden, I hear, before I even see it, a young girl sitting right about there, getting hit by her mother. And I'm gone. I'm not in the room anymore. Suddenly, I imagine myself as that little girl being hit, because I myself was hit as a young child. And that corporal punishment, that sense of powerlessness, that I couldn't intervene, and I have a value to intervene. I don't want this behavior to continue. But it was like I was frozen, literally glued to my chair. I could not move. And it really was probably just a matter of seconds. But I sort of kind of came back into the room and realized where I was and noticed that I was actually safe in this moment, that I wasn't actually being hit. But it was right about that time that I came back into the room that I realized my nephew was no longer sitting next to me. In those few seconds in which I had been frozen, he had purposefully and with great intention crossed the distance between us and that mother and her young child. Now, it was at this point I realized the events that are about to unfold, I am completely not in control of. And so I watched. I watched as my then 6-year-old nephew asked in a voice that probably only a 6-year-old, who had never himself experienced corporal punishment and had never seen a child hit before, turned to the mother and say, "Why are you hitting her?" It was a powerful moment for me. He felt completely confident. He knew he was totally safe and that no harm was going to come at him. He knew that he was the person to trust his thinking. Something's wrong here, and I can make the difference. He never hesitated. He did exactly what was correct in that moment. And we can too. Thank you.